I'd like to thank some co-sponsors for this very exciting talk tonight. Concordia's Simone de Beauvoir Institute, the Art History Department, Cynthia Hammond is here, thank you for your help with this, and the Center for Interdisciplinary Study of Society and Culture. This evening, we welcome Dr. Heather Davis to the series and back to her alma mater. Heather earned her PhD in communications at Concordia working with Monica King-Gagnon and continued her research and writing afterwards in 2 prestigious postdoctoral positions at Penn State and Duke University. She's currently a teaching fellow at the Cranbrook Academy of Art and has written widely for art and academic publications on questions of contemporary art, politics, and ecology. Heather is the editor of Art in the Anthropocene, Encounters Among Aesthetics, Politics, Environments, and Epistemologies. Her current book project, Plastics, I'm not using this, The Afterlife of Oil, examines the constitutive character of plastic in our contemporary world, its complicated inheritances, and its links to petrocapitalism. Tonight, Heather will be presenting on her latest book, Desire Change, Contemporary Feminist Art in Canada. It's a timely and much anticipated book that she'll be launching tomorrow at SBC Gallery. What time? At 3 o'clock at SBC in the Belgo building. You're all welcome to join. Yesterday evening, Heather met with a few students from the Studio Arts and Art History departments to discuss aspects of this book, of feminism, and its rich intersections with contemporary art in Canada. It was a wonderful meeting, and we thank you for making the time to do it, Heather. In a lively exchange with a couple of the seminar participants, something like a basic principle for feminism was negotiated. On the spot, between an author and her readers, or more to the point, between speakers and listeners, just working it out. The principle, as I recall, was something like, feminism is an action, or work, or labor, intellectual, creative, and emotional labor, not a mere label or self-description. It's not enough to proclaim one's feminism as a title, it's something done to affect social justice and to validate and encourage situated experience. The seminar conversation Dr. Davis facilitated brilliantly, and with such a light touch, was a model of exactly this kind of action. It left students feeling empowered, validated, and accountable as artists, writers, and thinkers. We're so thankful to have you here to continue the conversation tonight, Heather.
Thanks so much, Tamara. That was incredibly sweet. I really enjoyed meeting with all the students yesterday. You guys were all really brilliant, and it was really a pleasure. And I hope tonight it isn't too much of a repetition for you. And I also want to just sort of say thank you to everybody who made this possible. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to get to be in Montreal and amongst friends and colleagues. So I'm very pleased to be here. I want to start by acknowledging that Concordia University is on unceded Indigenous lands, and my apologies for my pronunciation in advance. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters we now call Montreal. Teotihuacan, and if anybody wants to come up and teach me how to say these words afterwards, I'd be... Can you say it again? Jojahage?
I think it's closer.
Jojahage. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it's obviously a home for lots of Indigenous folks and other peoples. But I want to say also that I'm an uninvited guest on these unceded lands, and that I want I hope that in the work that I'm doing in this book and in other places in my professional life, that I'm held accountable to the very complicated histories and violences of this country that have meant that our lives as settlers and Indigenous folks have been intertwined for the last 500 years. So if I'm not doing a good job of that, I also encourage you as part of my community to call me out and to ask me to do better. I'm going to mainly focus in this talk on desire change, but I'm also happy to answer questions afterwards about other projects if folks are interested. So first of all, why contemporary feminist art? So when I was getting together this talk, I decided to go back and go through some of the studies that have been published recently about the relationship of gender inequity in the arts. And to start from Michael Miranda's really brilliant study, which was published in Canadian Art this year, Hard Numbers, a Study on Diversity in Canada's Galleries. And what was really interesting about his study is that it shows that, if you just sort of looked at this graph, in and of itself, it looks pretty good, right? Especially in terms of gender equity, there's a lot of women who are participating in the arts. There's a lot of women who are participating in gallery management. But what's sort of under the surface of these numbers is the fact that the higher the income of the institution, the fewer women become present. And the higher the sort of ranking of executive directors or top curators, all of these kinds of positions are less and less you see less and less women in these positions. And so to sort of so basically his summary of this was that the bigger the gallery, the fewer the women in power, and the less money a gallery receives, the more likely its leadership will be Indigenous. I also looked at some of the older statistics, but I think I would have a feeling that many of these things are still relatively accurate, which is to talk about the percentages. So just really sort of parse, what does it mean to be a successful artist in Canada, right? And who is actually gaining the success and the kind of notoriety and who isn't. And keep in mind that when you see these statistics, that 56% of Canada's professional visual artists are women. So that's more than half, right? So we should really be seeing, if we want to see equitable numbers, we should really be seeing more than half of women being represented in these categories. And sadly, that is not in any way, shape, or form close to what was happening, at least between 1999 and 2012. As of 2006, it was reported that on average, female artists earn 28% less than the average earnings of male artists, and that hasn't really seemed to shift a whole lot in the intervening years. So, for example, in relationship to, I should also say that these slides come from Joyce Siemens and Amy Wallace's Where Are the Women Updating the Account in RACAR, which was published in 2013. And it's a really brilliant analysis of these kinds of facts and figures. And they also talk really beautifully and eloquently about the fact that just talking about numbers is not enough. So they do these 3 really nice case studies to try to flesh this out in terms of what this actually means for people's careers. And then the reason why you're not seeing trans or genderqueer or people who identify outside of a gender binary is because nobody who identified in those categories was applying in these years. But I think it would be important to go back and to re-look at those things in light of a wider recognition of the diversity of gender. So they also talk about, I think that some of these things are the points at which we need a lot of improvement. I'm focusing on the areas that need improvement in Canada in relationship to gender equity in the arts. There have been areas where there has been significant improvement. For example, in teaching, and Concordia is one of those places that's actually really incredible for the amount of wonderful women who teach and are full-time tenure track or tenured professors, so who are teaching in both studio arts and in the art history department. But in the places that need more work, there's in places like in the Canada Council for the Arts acquisition grants to art museums and public galleries. And again, you see a similar kind of range of the fact that you know, like women just don't make it to the 100,000 plus category, right? So basically, the higher up you go, the more money that's involved, the more power that's involved, women start to drop out of the picture, right? So the total value, again, from the same Rackar article, the total value of work by male artists acquired through the Canada Council for the Arts program was 87% greater for the value of work by female artists. So $1,964,884 were spent on acquiring works by male artists, and $1,050,976 for female artists. So that's nearly double, right? And then the average price for a work, so if you take out some of the anomalous works, some of the works that were extremely expensive, and then just do a kind of median comparison, the average price for a work by a male artist was $11,981 compared to $7,616 for women. Oh, sorry, that my mistake. The actual that was including the anomalous figures. The non-anomalous figures were $5,400 for male artists and $3,360 for female artists. And the most common price for work by male artists was $2,000, but which is almost twice the amount of what was paid to female artists, who got $1,250. I mean, clearly what you can see is the ways in which the fact that there's usually more women who are graduating from programs in studio arts, and then as soon as they enter into the art market, they start to automatically be paid about half of what their male colleagues are paid. And then when you sort of move through, it starts to get a little bit better, but you still end up with this really significant income gap. And then that's also reflected by things like the gallery demographics average, which is really poor. So these are statistics also from Canadian Art by this great article by Alison Cooley, Amy Luo, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this name as well, Chaume Morgan Fair, in an article called Canada's Galleries Fall Short, the Not So Great White North. And what they show is that there's such a huge disparity in institutional solo shows for women and also people of color, right? And then they broke it down again and said from 1998 to 2011, the National Gallery of Canada, for example, mounted 22 solo exhibitions by living Canadian male artists and 13 by living Canadian female artists. So again, almost double. And of those 22 solo exhibitions by male artists, 18, which is 82%, were accompanied by a catalog, and 9, which is 69% of the 13 exhibitions by female artists, had a catalog. And the fact that whether or not you get a catalog is a really big deal, right? Because if you have an institutional solo show, that's obviously really good for your career. But if you want your work to kind of resonate in terms of art historical practices, if you want it to be able to be taken up in university classrooms and in other kinds of art historical records, if without a catalog you don't have that same kind of credibility or weight, right? So these are the reasons why it's important to sort of focus on that. And then just quickly to say about the MAC here in Montreal, sadly it is not doing well at all. And so maybe we can encourage them collectively as a community to do a bit better in terms of institutional solo shows for women. So this is where MAWA steps in. So MAWA is the people who actually commissioned Desire Change. It's that organization is the reason why this book exists. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of history of who MAUA is as an organization, and why they're so amazing. So in September 1983, Plug-in Art, which is now Plug-in ICA in Winnipeg, formed a women's committee to look at the ways to promote and integrate women's arts in the Winnipeg visual arts community. And then from that working group, they started MAUA in 1984. And the two sort of co-founders of MAUA were Diane Whitehouse and Sheila Butler. And it's important to note that both of those women came from working class families, and they both came from families who had a strong commitment to labor practices and to Marxism. And so they were extremely committed to paying women. So one of the really nice things about working on this book is that every single person involved was paid. I was paid. My brilliant managing editor, Nicole Bush, who was such a pleasure to work with, she was paid. The writers were paid, and all of the artists were paid Carfax fees for the inclusion of their images. And Diane Whitehouse really saw this as a feminist principle, because so often women are asked to do labor for free, right? This happens all the time. Women are asked to volunteer. Women are expected to volunteer. Our labor is not counted in the same way, and we can see that in terms of wage inequality. So Diane Whitehouse says, at the time there was a great deal of discussion on the board, and she means the board of Plug-in, in the community and amongst the art school sessionals, who were mainly women, about the lack of opportunities for women artists. There was a perception that Plug-in was inaccessible to local women artists, and it seemed virtually impossible for women to secure tenured faculty positions at the School of Art. There were more women than men graduating from the art school, but somehow the women just seemed to disappear from the scene after graduation. The situation prompted the question, is this as good as it gets for women? So this was their amazing response, was to start MAUA. And so some of what the core of what MAUA does, which I think is really important and super interesting and was written about very eloquently in the book by Noni Brynjolfsson, which is a mentorship program. So they sort of asked themselves, what might be the ways in which to promote women artists and to have women learn from each other. So they started this mentorship program, and the startup grant was actually from the federal government, directed towards the support of women seeking professional status in all fields. So it wasn't actually an arts grant. And what was interesting is when Sheila Butler talks about the early history of MAUA, she says that some men actually approached them at the time and asked if they could also be included in the mentorship program. And obviously MAUA's mission is to support women and women-identified people, but also actually because of the parameters of the grant, because it was not actually an arts grant, because it was a federal grant to support gender equity in the workforce, they actually couldn't do that. It wasn't within the kind of parameters of what they could do. But I think it's really also very interesting that this is how MAUA started. So it started through this gender equity program rather than through specifically an arts program. And I think that it speaks to the kind of cross-disciplinary nature of MAUA and their ongoing commitment to the professionalization of women artists. So the model of the organization is based on the idea that mentorship as a non-hierarchical, peer-based system of learning is key to passing down information, experience, and confidence from one generation of women artists to another, strengthening both artists simultaneously. And the first mentorship program featured 4 pairs of artists and culminated in an exhibition of work by the mentees at the Plug-in Gallery in December 1985, which is what you're seeing the advertisement for here. MAUA also has other things going on, so in case you're interested, they pay people to write short critical pieces for their newsletters. They have a residency program. Anyone can apply for the mentorship program, so if you're interested, please go on their website and check it out. And they also do events, symposia, ongoing workshops, and of course this book, which they commissioned for their 30th anniversary. And they also have, so part of what this book is involved with is they have a feminist art library that's both accessible online and that some of their collections are also there and in other places in Winnipeg. But it's a really great resource for people who are interested in learning more about feminist art and feminist art in Canada. And it shows the commitment to the ongoing historiography of feminist artists. So one of the things that I first did when I was hired as the editor was I was like, oh great, okay, I'm gonna edit this book on contemporary feminist art. I'm gonna look in Canada. I'm gonna look to see what the other books on contemporary feminist art in Canada are. And it turns out there are very few, and one could argue that there isn't really a collection like this that has appeared before. And a lot of the, there's been some really amazing advances and really amazing art writing that is, and art historiography that has come out, especially of Concordia, actually, by many of the professors here. But a lot of the precursors to sort of thinking explicitly about feminist art and contemporary feminist art in Canada were actually coming from publications like this, which were published by the Women's Press and also by La Centrale. So what's really interesting when I was looking through the history of who was publishing work on feminist art, it was often artist-run centers, right? And what I think is really important to sort of reiterate in the context of this book is that this book would never have come to exist if it weren't for the amazing and brilliant folks at MAUA, primarily Shauna Dempsey and Dana Kleckty. And so I think that it really speaks to the ways in which feminist historiography is still being written in this country, which is that it's being written from artist-run centers, from people who are working on the ground, from a kind of more dispersed framework. And I think that has its benefits, but I think it's also maybe indicative of these kinds of larger trends in the art world where the kind of more established and more endowed institutions are not the places where feminist artwork and feminist art historiography is happening to the extent that in comparison to how it's being done in terms of artist-run centers. And then potentially that isn't the case here at Concordia at the moment, but so I feel a little bit funny making that statement. But I think in general, that actually is the case. And I think that it's the practice of feminist art historiography is so vital and important because so many people are working and doing really amazing work. But if there's no way in which that gets recorded, then we have no way of passing that down to future generations. And Lisa Steele writes about this really beautifully in this essay called "Committed to Memory," and she says, "Remembering our own lives, our mothers' lives, our neighborhoods, our jobs, the lives of others we knew, remembering before it disappeared. No one else was talking about it. We had to. History is produced by whomever writes it down first. History should never be mistaken for the truth." And I think that that is definitely a premise that I kept in mind when I was editing this collection. But she also very poignantly talks about, Steele talks very poignantly about remembering as a kind of act of survival. And so I think that is really the importance of feminist art historiography. And Alyssa Firth-Eaglin and Candace Hopkins say this really beautifully in their introduction to the F word. And they say, feminism often elicits more questions than answers. And although the impact of feminist thought and action are now a part of everyday life, the hard-won struggles on issues of representation and empowerment are increasingly normalized or deliberately unrecognized. The idea of feminism as an ongoing movement, rather than something that took place during a fixed point in time, often cited as ending in the early 1980s, is frequently lost. And I think that one of the amazing things about this particular moment in time is that we are seeing a resurgence of interest in feminism. We are seeing resurgence of interest in major galleries taking on feminist topics. And sort of despite the problems with the kind of ongoing inequity, there's actually been a lot of movement and a lot of work being done to really address those problems at structural levels. So I think that I'm really hoping that this is sort of like the beginning of 100 books that get published on feminist art, contemporary feminist art in Canada. I'll leave that up to you guys to do, but I really think that this moment is really quite hopeful in terms of feminism in relationship to contemporary art in Canada. Mainly I focused on contemporary art because that's my own interest and focus, and that is what I know best. Being trained actually not as an art historian, but as somebody coming out of the communications department, leads me towards a bias, or I have a bias towards the present. I'm not a very good historian, so that was my own kind of conceptual framing. But I was also really interested in the questions of where are we now in terms of feminist art production in Canada, and where would we like to move, or how would we like to go forward? So that was those were really the questions that were on my mind in terms of organizing and curating the collection. But I did want there to be some acknowledgement that the artworks that are being created as part of the contemporary moment weren't being created in a vacuum, right? That there was actually this incredibly long history of contemporary art from a feminist point of view in Canada. And even though the book actually doesn't go back super far, the oldest kind of references are from 1963, I think it at least indicates that a lot of the things that people are picking up now have this kind of recursive relationship to the past, that younger artists are drawing upon older artists, older women feminist artists, and reworking a lot of those ideas in really productive and interesting ways. With that in mind, I got Christina Huno and Janice Anderson to write a really brilliant short introduction to the book that sort of accompanies my introduction, that gives a sense of how we got here. And then also at the end of the book, Gina Badger compiled a really incredible timeline that goes from 1963 to the present. And in that is an incredible kind of resource and archive of all kinds of different feminist art practices, but she also was careful and insistent about making sure that we also included various kinds of historical moments or events in time that really significantly contributed to our understandings of what it might mean to be producing feminist art. So that was how the book was framed, and then in the middle was primarily stuff from the last 25 years. And I decided that I wanted the book. So the question was, how on earth to kind of organize a collection of contemporary art in Canada when there's actually the other amazing thing was that when I first started working on the project, myself and Nicole sat down with the kind of lists that everyone had produced in relationship to who could potentially be contributors in terms of writers and who could potentially be whose work we might want to consider in terms of artists. And the list was like 4 or 5 pages long, all single-spaced. So clearly there's no lack of interest or lack of production of feminist art in Canada. And so the question was really like, oh my gosh, like there's so many things that I would have loved to have included in this book that it was just simply not possible to include. But I did want to provide some kind of conceptual framework for the book that would sort of carry through all of the kind of divergent practices and interests and geographies and identities that are contained within it. So I decided to frame it around the concept of desire. So the way that I'm thinking about it is that if the desire of feminism is for a future that is different from the world that we currently inhabit, the desire of the feminist art historian is to enable other futures to be imagined. This is also the task of feminist art. So this is a book framed by such a desire. It is a desire for social change, for the creation of spaces not dictated by patriarchy, so that our imaginations will have more freedom to move. Desire pushes us beyond our boundaries. It breaks us apart. It dissolves the divisions between the self and the world, recognizing the permeability of the skin, the porousness and morphability of our bodies. The concept of desire speaks to what captures us, of the way in which we become caught up with the world and by the world, by objects and people around us. Desire is what overwhelms, often pushing us beyond the boundaries of the self, sometimes unsolicited. Desire bridges and breaks boundaries. Desire is about sexuality and sexual expression, the complicated, myriad, and fluid forms that it takes. Women have frequently been positioned by desire, erased of their own desire, construed as objects through the mechanism of patriarchy. But this version of desire is being increasingly put into question as women assert their own desire and desire for change. And that's what I would argue that all of the writers and all of the artists are doing in this book. Desire, as has been argued by philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, is the driving force of capitalism, harnessing its creative energy for the service of profit. This can be seen in the pillaging of natural resources, the exploitation of cheap labor, and the ways in which we are addressed simply as consumers. However, desire can equally be used to challenge these systematic mechanisms of oppression, while expressing our innermost thoughts, dreams, and projects for social justice and change. Desire, I argue, and I would say many of the contributors are in this argumentation with me, is a form of resistance. It is a way to push against the damaging narratives and the narratives of damage that get continually retold about marginalized communities. Desire provides a way not just to resist, but to insist on other realities and other movements, to insist on the strength of one's own power and the power of feminist community. Desire is what propels, what insists on the possibilities of new kinds of worlds. So this was the conceptual framework that I was organizing the book around. But I also, especially after having gone through the peer review process, felt it was necessary to maybe make a few statements on what contemporary feminism might mean, especially in relationship to Canadian art production. So I wrote, as sort of interludes in the book, these three very short propositions for 21st century feminism. And I'm just going to go through them and talk a little bit about them. So proposition 1, on sex, gender, and feminism. Maybe I have to read it off of, we'll see. It's really small on my screen. It is impossible to write a definition of feminism because feminism is meant to address and redress the historical imposition of patriarchy. That is, the practice of oppression against women. Women suggests a category that seems at once self-apparent, but begins to shift and break and tear under the weight of more than half the human inhabitants of the planet. How on earth could any category account for all these people, all their lives and loves and struggles? Any articulation of feminism, then, is always partial and incomplete and necessarily located. It can only be truthful in the locatedness of a given person, a given subject, a given position or point of view. Feminism begins from the fundamental questioning of patriarchy and heteronormativity in whichever ways these manifest in people's lives and in their articulations of collectivity and being together. The permutations of our bodies and the other systems of oppression that we all live with although in radically divergent ways with hugely variant degrees of harm, open feminism up to this always partial way of addressing gender, sex, and sexuality. The point is that we are not one. We are not one body, nor one gender, nor one sex, nor one race or ability or age. Feminism itself is the realization of the not one. There is no position that can be outside of embodiment, and that body is a body that bleeds, that secretes, that has loves and friends, and ones they hold dear. That body is a body that desires, and in that desire creates new worlds and new possibilities for feminism and for art. So I really do mean this as a kind of propositional statement, and even now when I look back on this statement, there's things that I wish I could edit or change about it. But I think the thing that really that I really wanted to start from was this understanding that feminism was really about the not one. And for me, that really comes from a lot of French feminist theory, especially Luce Irigaray, in her understanding of the relationship of the sexes, and also in thinking through the Western modernist project and the project of patriarchy, which is to posit that there's always one, right, and that if you're not male, then you're not male, right, rather than to think that there's actually two. Right, and the moment when she argues, the moment when you think that there's two, that automatically actually opens up for multiplicity. That once you move away from the logic of the one, you end up in the logic of the multiple. And to me, that was the place where feminism starts. Which is a refusal of the kind of master subject or master proposition that has been imposed on all of us, at least in the context of Canada for the last 500 years. And so this, or 400 or so. But this elaboration of the idea of the multiple, I think, is also coming and has been really well articulated by people like Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledges and Adrienne Rich's Politics of Location. So to really reiterate that the ways in which we engage politically are always multiple, entangled, historically situated, and contextually embodied positions. And that this doesn't foreclose collective action, in fact, and it doesn't foreclose collective identity, but it does allow for the possibility of openings, right? And I think one of the things that's really amazing about the kind of history of feminist thought and the history of feminist art production is that there's always been a reckoning with this, right? That the category, for example, of woman has never been a self-apparent category. This has always been a category that has been up for contestation, and I think that a lot of that contestation obviously has come from the brilliance of Black, Indigenous, and people of color feminisms, and I'm especially sort of thinking about the precursors of Sojourner Truth and elaborated by Hortense Spillers and others, but that this category just cannot be self-apparent because of the nature of the relationship to a patriarchal structure and because of this kind of fundamental not one position. So any attempt to define, Mary Fraser writes in Instabilité, any attempt to define the exhaustive and systematic limits of feminism would be a futile endeavor. The very foundations of feminism seek to deconstruct the notion of a master concept and its restrictive domination of discourse. And I think that this is actually primarily helpful, right? We often want to think that if you don't have a kind of coherent or masterful discourse, that somehow that implies a weakness. But in many ways, I think this actually is an incredible strength. And there's many other people who would argue that with me. For example, Monica Kangagnon writes, this tendency towards introspection and propensity for self-analysis in feminism can be seen as both its strongest and most significant characteristic. And so I really felt strongly in trying to put together a volume that was doing, can you continue to do this? But actually, in a lot of ways, it probably didn't. That probably didn't have to be particularly self-conscious, because I think this really is the premise upon which a lot of feminist art writers and feminist feminist artists are already working. And I think that this kind of sense of a necessary self-reflection, I think, allows feminism to be multiple and riotous and plural and appear in many different forms. And that's not always necessarily progressive or good, but I think it has a kind of flexibility to its form that is always there's always useful. So, for example, Jin Mi-yoon says in relationship to feminism, I don't disavow feminism, feminisms in the plural, because there is a kind of self-reflexivity there. I think that's important, that kind of level of doubt, constant doubt that isn't insecurity, but is a kind of productive, generative, generous doubt. I think this leaves room for the other. And Tanya Lucan Linklater also writes in the volume of the importance of not knowing and of making room. And I think that these principles are really at the core of what contemporary feminism might mean or might be. And so in this project, feminism is not just about creating a level playing field, which, as I sort of articulated at the beginning, has still yet to happen. But it is also fundamentally about transforming the ways in which we understand notions of gender, sexuality, and social organization. So in this, the work of feminism has always been both critical, providing insightful analysis and critiques of patriarchy and other systems of oppression, but also creative, right? So in the process of wanting to create different kinds of worlds, we both have to understand what it is that we're fighting against, what it is that we don't want to see repeated, but we also have to have some kind of a vision of how things could be otherwise, right? And I think that what's really amazing about the artworks that are contained within the book is that they all have this kind of vision of the otherwise. And sometimes it's a kind of fantastical proposition. Sometimes it's not actionable. Sometimes you wouldn't even want it to be actionable. But the fact that there's the space of the otherwise, I think, is fundamental to the ways in which we think about contemporary feminist art. So the other thing, obviously, about thinking about contemporary feminist art production within what we now call Canada is, and it was kind of ironic to me, or it was an unintended thing that the book ended up appearing this year, which is the 150th year of the violent imposition of a nation state and the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples. And so because of that, I mean, not just because of the year, obviously, this book has been Canada has been existing for 150 years. But because of that, I felt that it was extremely necessary to really take seriously what does it mean to think through colonial patriarchy and matriarchal decolonization. And myself as a white settler, I mean, this is a bit like I'm probably not the best person to actually speak to these processes, but I also believe that we are bound up together, and we're violently bound together, and we have been violently bound together for all of this time. And so it's all of our responsibilities, even if we're sort of clumsy in our articulations, to begin to try to enact this project of decolonization. I mean, one of the things that really got brought up in relationship to the artworks that were analyzed, and also in terms of some of the essays that especially Cheyenne Turian's essay on that was dealing with the National Gallery of Canada and Sakahan, was really the kind of question of, well, what is the relationship between decolonization and cultural production, right? So if we really want to take seriously the fact that decolonization is actually mostly about land and it's mostly about Indigenous sovereignty, then what is the relationship of something like art production to that project, right? And clearly representational formations are incredibly important in terms of our imaginaries, but I think there is a complicated relationship in terms of thinking through what decolonization might mean for cultural workers, especially as so many of us are implicated in the systems of the government, right? I write in relationship to this, to think about feminism and feminist art in Canada necessitates a consideration of decolonization. We are bound together through the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. Settlers to continue to benefit structurally from genocide and accumulation through dispossession of Indigenous peoples. Art practices alone cannot adequately address everything that needs to change in relation to these ongoing realities, but they can provide means of imagining otherwise and outside of colonial frameworks, creating spaces of self-representation. They can provide modes of critique, of resistance, of brilliant propositions, and ingenious models of relationality. Through decolonial self-love and rematriation, art can create avenues for Indigenous women and trans people to be the holders of their multiple and diverse identities. And settler allies can use their privileged access as platforms for Indigenous voices to be amplified, to begin to affect and infect the colonial structures of the nation state, so slowly, but ever so surely, shift those structures towards modes of Indigenous-led governance and imaginaries. So obviously this section of the book focuses primarily on Indigenous writers and Indigenous artists, and I think that one of the ways to sort of talk about our settler colonial present is through this notion of haunting that Eve Tuck and C. Ree write so beautifully about in the glossary of haunting. And they write that they are specters that collapse time, rendering empire's foundational past impossible to erase from the national present. And I think that's an incredibly beautiful way of articulating the fact that even though there's some people who might wish to see the colonial past as somehow in the past, that is incredibly impossible, right? And that in fact we really just need to sit down and have honest conversations about where we're at and what to do. And clearly, the reason why it's incredibly important to think through questions of decolonization in relationship to a book on feminism and feminist art is that one of the primary ways through which colonial structures, or one of the primary ways that colonialism functioned was by the imposition of heteropatriarchy and heteropaternalism. So this is one of the primary mechanisms by which colonization happened, right? So with a disruption of people of the kind of sense of being a people for many Indigenous nations, and with serious material consequences. So it is important to note that in many cases, the enforcement of proper gender roles is entangled in settler nations' attempts to limit and manage Indigenous peoples' claims to land. So that these are imposed systems of understanding gender, sex, and sexuality. These are not the relationships of heteropatriarchy are not Indigenous to this part of the world. And so if we really want to also take this project of feminism seriously, we need to look at the ways in which patriarchy is bound up to colonialism, especially in relationship to the land that we live in. And Kim Tallbear writes really beautifully about how this is also tied to questions of Indigenous sovereignty and also to questions of ecological survival, so that the imposed notion of a nuclear family structure where everybody has a binary sexual identity is actually a fundamentally unstable and vulnerable position to be holding, and that if we develop different kinds of, if we have an understanding of the world where kinship structures are not bound by those strict biological formations that are formed through nuclear family structures, then in fact we're going to be far more adaptable to the futures that are coming, even in terms of our ecological futures that we have to be thinking about. So this is just a further argument for the importance of turning things over to Indigenous governance as much as possible. So Arvin, Tuck, and Morrill write very beautifully in an article about decolonizing feminism that they say we argue that allying oneself with feminism should not require consenting to inclusion within a larger agenda of whiteness. Indeed, we believe that Native feminist theories demonstrate that feminisms, when allied with other key causes, hold a unique potential to decolonize the ascendancy of whiteness in many global contexts. And I think it's an incredibly poignant and incredibly insightful analysis, and one I think that really stems from the fact of feminism always in and of itself being a project that's questioning master concepts, right? So not to reinscribe their thought onto a Western framework, but rather that feminism as a project, because it is so expansive and has these mechanisms always built within it to be self-reflexive, to question master narratives, to do all of that kind of work, it's also particularly well positioned to think through the complexities of projects like decolonization. So they also write, as feminism and gender and women's studies continue to grow as political and scholarly projects, their future is dependent on a willingness to, as we have written, not just include Native feminist theories as a specialized subfield, but instead to re-examine and rewrite the very terms by which they operate. If such a rewriting is accomplished, feminism might realign its end goals towards dismantling not just heteropatriarchy, but also the settler colonial nation states that heteropatriarchy upholds and will achieve not only gender parity, but also decolonization. And one of the essays in this book that I think illustrates this way of doing things really quite beautifully is Tanya Lucan-Linklater's essay. And in the essay, she does the thing that you're really not supposed to do as an art writer, which is that she writes about performances that she's never seen. So she writes about the performances through traces of the performances and through conversations with the performers after or in between when the performances actually happen. And she talks about this as a deliberate act, right? She does this deliberately, not just because she couldn't go and see the performances, but she does it because she wants to upset this notion of the relationship of an art writer somehow having a kind of masterful or global access to a performance, right? That they can somehow transmit the truth of a performance, right? And by not even seeing the performance in the first place, it becomes extremely apparent that that is not what's happening, right? That she's doing something else in the writing itself. Like the writing itself is providing a resonance with the performances, which in a way are occurring just in her imaginary, right? So it's an entirely new way to think about the concept of art criticism, of art historiography, and I think that these are the kinds of propositional models that are incredibly necessary, and also I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but that also institutions like the Feminist Art Gallery, that is a project by Alison Mitchell and Deidre Logue, are really trying to grapple with. So they were kind of trying to grapple with the question of what would it mean to host a feminist art biennale? What does that look like? Like, how would you even mount that? You know, what are the kinds of questions and concerns that would have to be taken into consideration? Can you even have something like a biennale in relationship to feminist art practice and really take it seriously? And so I think that what all of these things are really indicating are the ways in which we can't just take for granted. So maybe going back to what Tamara so beautifully laid out as a kind of another proposition for feminism, which is that feminism happens by way of actions, right? Feminism happens by way of producing certain kinds of institutional frames and certain kinds of institutional structures, and that those don't have to be and shouldn't be just accepted as inherited from previous places. I also want to say that that in relationship to questions of decolonization, I would argue that the same colonial logic that wages cultural genocide on Indigenous peoples is that also, and so the logic of white supremacy is also that which polices the borders of the stolen land from immigrants, which manifested in a whites-only immigration policy until 1967 in Canada, and that historically relied upon indentured laborers and slaves from Asia and Africa. And so included in this section is an essay about the work of Camille Turner, and even though in some ways, you know, it was a bit of a toss-up for me in terms of where this essay would reside in the book. I felt it was necessary because the essay deals so much with issues of post-coloniality and colonialism, that it fit within these larger conversations of colonialism and decolonization, because we need to think through the ways in which white supremacy is articulated in relationship to colonialism and against other people of color. So we require new language. This is a quote from Janine Frey-Najutli of the Rematriate Collective. And she says very forcefully, we require new language to articulate the diverse needs and politics of Indigenous women, and we do not have a convenient pan-politic. This is why putting a race before the word isn't enough. Instead of Indigenous feminism, I propose we rematriate our sets of relationships to each other's, to ourselves, and to the land. And I think this is a really powerful argument and articulation, not just for the kind of sets of easy identity, or maybe not so easy, but the sets of identity markers, but also for the power of the action of feminist art practice, the power of the action and the material realization of feminist projects. So I think that just highlights that relationship, their work is great. So I'm just very briefly going to talk about the last section, which is on institutional critique. So feminist art practices are at once an analytical and political position. As such, feminist art has always been interested in the structural elements that condition the ways in which art is produced, accessed, and experienced. Critiquing the gated, stifling, and privileged structures of traditional art venues, such as galleries and museums, is necessary in thinking beyond art as capital to art as a valued and valuable practice within everyday life. Feminist art institutions use principles of feminist organizing through collective action to begin to build worlds of art practices that push at the edges of conventional spaces and work to transform the understandings of contemporary art. Building together has been and continues to be a central aim of feminist art practices that address not only questions of representation, but also questions of community and collective action. Contemporary institutional critique engages with these messy problems of institution building, of recognizing that we need to risk engagement by building the kinds of organizations that we want and need, from art centers to publications to platforms we haven't yet even imagined. So in this section, there's two essays that are primarily essays about institutional critique that actually enact institutional critique, and I would argue that institutional critique has always been really important to feminist art practice. And so the first one is by Cheyenne Turian, and she is talking about this piece by Nadia Meyer, which, when it was originally exhibited in the context of the Sakahan exhibition, that the National Gallery of Canada put up a disclaimer both next to her work individually and also a disclaimer on the entrance to the entire exhibition, which was the first exhibition of Indigenous art from around the world that was held at the National Gallery of Canada. And so she writes really incisively about questions of the ways in which, I mean, she says, I'll just quote her because she'll say it better than I will. There is something profoundly unresolved between the force of Sakahan and the National Gallery of Canada's unwillingness to accept the ways the gallery itself is implicated in the ongoing settler colonial project in Canada, both as a mechanism of cultural proliferation and as a federal institution. And so for me, the question that really was raised in relationship to this piece and to this controversy, and what was really interesting that I found out yesterday from Tamer was that even though the National Gallery of Canada then acquired this piece, they acquired this piece with the caveat that the original didactic, which explained this piece's relationship to the Kokums who sort of started the Idle No More movement in December of 2013, that didactic that explained this piece's connection to the Idle No More movement be removed from the piece. So now when you go to see this piece in the National Gallery of Canada, there is neither a disclaimer by the National Gallery of Canada saying that the piece no longer is objectionable to them, but there's also no longer a description of the relationship of why this piece is called what it is, which is actually a direct quote from the grandmothers who started the Idle No More movement. So for me, the question that is really left behind is really this question of, is it possible to have a national institution genuinely engage in the work of cultural decolonization? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's one that we really need to think through very significantly. And Amy Fung also brings up these kinds of questions in her piece, which is also another very brilliant piece that really questions the form of art criticism and the ways in which art criticism happens. And so even the form of the piece reads more like a poem than it does like normal art criticism, or the ways in which we've come to accept what that might mean. And she says that, and in this, she's really questioning the ways in which feminism, like engagement with the arts more generally, is often merely in the service of securing people's middle-class exclusionary values, rather than as a radical project of social transformation that resists hierarchicalization and marginalization. So I think that she's really kind of inciting us to do better in terms of our relationships to these things, and to really be thinking through the questions of our relationship between art and our implication in artistic systems, and what it might mean to be creating political art, and how that actually affects social justice movements. But of course, the response sort of by feminists was never just one of critique, but also, as I said earlier, is also about creation and creative responses. And so it also significantly involves processes of institution building. And so there's a number of essays that take this up. There's a beautiful essay by Noni about Mawa. And then there's a really great interview with many people who are involved with Mary Kelly's seminar in the 1980s, I believe, in Vancouver, and how from that seminar and from those close interactions and from the kind of building of this sort of contentious feminist community there, that so many organizations were sort of sprung out of that moment. And then this is also an interior view of the Feminist Art Gallery, which is the project by Deirdre Logue and Alison Mitchell, that is also engaging and grappling with questions of feminist institutions and feminist institution building. And so, I see the book in general as hopefully an intervention and an extrapolation of building upon all the work of these incredibly brilliant thinkers and artists that I've had the pleasure of working with for the past 3 or 4 years. So thanks for your attention. I welcome your comments and questions.
So you spoke very eloquently about the flexibility of feminist form in art, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, having edited this book, the flexibility of form in terms of art history, feminist art history. Is there a flexibility of form?
So that's a really good question, and I think that for me, so one of the things that I decided to do as an editor, which I think was in part a decision that I was able to do because this book was being published not just by an academic press, but also by Mawa, which is that I decided to commission essays from artists, from curators, from cultural workers, and art historians. And so I think to a certain degree that was maybe my interest in trying to push feminist art historiography in new and different directions. And I mean, I wasn't going to do that myself. I mean, as an editor, that's not one's job. But but I certainly was interested in people who might do that. And I would definitely argue that that Amy Fung's essay or intervention in the book is certainly within those lines. Also, Tanya Lucan Linklater's work that I mentioned earlier is also within those lines. And I think that there is actually a real flexibility of form. I mean, Amelia Jones's writings about performance, part of the reason why they're such seminal works is because I think that she was really starting to take a different kind of take in terms of feminist art historiography, like that the work itself is demanding and asking of us to do different things in terms of writing, in terms of creating kinds of archives. One of the difficulties of doing feminist art historiography is because of the diversity of practices and the necessity to really think through questions of how might we do this differently, and not just in terms of who is represented, but also the forms in which things get represented. So I would certainly say that I think there is a lot of flexibility, or I would like there to be a lot of flexibility. I'm not sure, not working within an art history background or department, I'm not sure that I can speak to questions of how that then functions in terms of people's careers or any of that kind of stuff, right? Because I think that those kinds of mechanisms are actually incredibly important to think through, and so if as a tenure track professor you were to write something like what Emmy Fung wrote for this book, would it be taken as seriously by the review committee, for example, as a single author peer review journal article, right? And are there single author peer review journal articles that would publish a piece that looks more like poetry than what we normally consider art history writing? And so I think that those are the kinds of the limitations. So, I certainly took the opportunity of this book as a place to try to think through some of those questions in terms of form, but how much that sort of gets permeated out in the discipline, you'd probably be in a much better position to say than I am.
I'm in the MFA program, so I'm asking from the position of a maker. I'm wondering if you believe artists of privilege, white and/or male, have a responsibility to use their position of privilege as a platform for supporting other marginalized artists or people who are working from a more marginalized position. And do you have any thoughts as to how they would do this without recapitulating non-white binary othering?
Yeah, so in terms of how those mechanisms get played, yes. So the answer to the first part of the question is yes, and the answer to the second part of the question I think is much more complicated, because we all know of many examples where people say that that's what they're doing, and then it seems like actually what they're doing is just reifying their own power, right? That using their association with marginalized communities or disempowered or disenfranchised communities as a way to basically make themselves look good, right? And that this consolidates their career and allows them to gain notoriety and a certain kinds of privileged access. This happens all the time, right? So how to go about doing that without kind of remobilizing the power positions that we have, I think is a question that we really do need to sit and think about quite consciously. There's definitely lots of things that people can do, right? You can invite, when you're inviting people to come and speak, and you're going to pay them to do that. If you have access to institutional money of any kind for any purpose, you can use that institutional money to pay people who are in positions that don't reify normative power positions. There's so many different kinds of ways I think that we can do this, and that especially as a white settler, there's certainly lots of ways in which I could probably do this better, to be honest, but there's also lots of ways in which that I really do have access to institutional support in ways that other people just don't. Or, you know, whatever institutional support I have, I think that it needs to be used to try to bring in more people into this conversation. But I would say that the one thing that we don't want to be doing is we don't want to be asking people of color, women, people who fall outside the gender binary, so trans and other non-binary, genderqueer folks. We don't want to be asking them for their labor without paying them. So I think that is one of the fundamental things that we have to be very conscious of. Those are some thoughts. I'm sure other people have more thoughts.
Oh yeah, we're recording on the mic.
Okay. Who else has a question? Down there, go ahead.
I recently read an article by Nicholas Mirsoff, and he was talking about art in the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, he says that he calls for a counter-visuality of the Anthropocene, and he says that we should be looking for decolonization of our biosphere. And I'm just curious to see if we can do such a feat without having already dealt with the decolonization of our own land and/or patriarchy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would actually argue, I love Nick's work, and I think he is an interesting thinker. And I think that I would actually argue that, yes, I think we can do some of that work without doing the work of decolonizing land. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be doing that work. It's like, but it's not that it's not that we need to do the one project before the other project can start. I think that those projects can operate in tandem. And part of the reason why I say that is because, I recently co-authored a paper with Zoe Todd where we argued that building upon the work of all kinds of other people, such as Lawrence Gross and Kyle White and Kutcher Rising Baldy, on the relationships of how climate change can be seen not just as incidentally affecting Indigenous and other marginalized people, but rather that climate change is the goal of colonialism, right? Because colonialism, what it was trying to do was to actually modify and change the hydrosphere, the biosphere, and the atmosphere, and it successfully did that, right? And so what we're seeing is the successful outcome of the colonial project. It's not incidental or like a kind of afterthought or externalization of colonialism. So and then also Max Leboiron and others have written a really beautiful paper arguing that pollution, especially and in the context of her work, plastic pollution can be seen as a form of colonization because it is polluting all of this land, and that people without their consent are being affected by this material that people and all of their non-human relations, all their non-human kin, are being affected by this material that they had no ability or opportunity to consent to, right? So that you can understand that also as a form of colonization. So I think that the projects around environmental justice can certainly happen in tandem with projects around land and sovereignty.
I'm just wondering, what kind of framework did Mawa give you for building the book?
None.
But this was a project that had begun before you came to it to build it.
Okay, yeah. So they did give me a little bit. They were like, we would like you to edit a book on feminist art in Canada. Yeah. But they didn't specify the contemporary, they didn't specify the conceptual framework, they didn't specify the authors or the artists. Nothing else about the book was all of that were my decisions. Yeah. And they were incredible to work for. If any of you ever have the opportunity to work for a feminist art organization, I would highly recommend it as an experience. Yeah.
They looked especially cool in the 1985
I know, right? I know, I love that image so much.
We'll take one more question because you've got more to do tomorrow at the launch.
I do, yes.
We can continue the conversation there if you don't get a chance to ask your question tonight. So one more question before we wrap it up. It's a lot of responsibility, eh? Go for it.
Just as you said that, I put my hand up. Sort of a continuing question about the early collaboration with MAWA. Was it always a project that was going to take the form of a book, or were there discussions of other modes of disseminating these conversations and these projects?
Actually, Nicole would probably be in a better position to answer that question, but as far as I know, it was always to make a book. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I mean, I think that in part it was, recognizing the necessity that we need to have these more tangible forms, that I think that there's a lot of really incredible and amazing feminist art historiography that already exists as articles, as things in people's archives, as various other kinds of ephemera, but to have something that's sort of as materially solid as a book is the thing that was missing. So I believe that was what their intention always was. At least that's what was communicated to me. But perhaps if they had hired somebody else, then it would have ended up in a completely different form. I don't know.
I think it was always going to be a book.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Just to say that you're all welcome to come to SBC Gallery tomorrow from 3 to 5. We have the privilege of being able to have 2 conversations, one with Lise Landry, Nicole, and Myriam Jacabalor, who are going to talk about Quebecois feminism and intergenerational feminism. And then also Alice, Jim, and Mary Sue Yuang are going to talk as well about feminism and racism and in the context of Quebec. So it's going to be a wonderful discussion, and if you're all welcome to come. And if you're interested in buying the book, go to MAWA's website. There's a way to locate the book there, and you can order it from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.